Good morning. We'll be in Matthew 5 again, continuing the Sermon on the Mount and just finished up the Beatitudes. I couldn't remember if we quite finished off the last teaching, so I want to kind of start there, and then we'll move into what occurs after this section of 6. There were 6 things Jesus spoke about. He quoted the Old Testament, set his teaching up beside it to expound upon it, and really take the focus back into sort of how it lands within us as people and image bearers. And that whole thing was important to understand his context of the understanding of the law was different than most of us tend to think of. Jesus saw the law as being grounded in love for God and for people, because that was the reflection of God himself. And that is a really good, simple thing to remember, I think, to kind of set the framework so that you, when you read about it in the Bible, you approach it from the way Jesus seemed to teach it, as opposed to what we tend to do is pull stuff out and apply it, which is a good thing, but sometimes in that process you aren't faithful to the original sort of bigger picture. We're trying to do something specific and targeted, which is often a very good thing to do, but sometimes it doesn't sit well in the broader context. If you know the broader context, it helps to know you can see what people are doing. Jesus, just to remind you folks, the slide set up is Torah. On one side, Jesus is teaching; on the other, because that's the way he taught it. He would quote the Old Testament and then talk about it. And we talked about in the context of what it meant to fulfill the law. So it wasn't the idea of not transgressing is sort of, that's like the ground floor. You sort of, that's almost a given. But the law was pointing to and grounded in something else, which was the law reflects who God is. So it's love God, love people. And when we talked about this, the idea of the Ten Commandments are structured that way, right? Some of which he quotes directly. The first section of the Ten Commandments is about our loving and honoring God. The last ones are about how we treat people. So in this context, the last two, and I don't remember if we finished them all, so I just kind of want to make sure we hit them again real quick. Retaliation is that's a tricky one. So what Jesus is talking about, and when he winds up quoting from this passage in Exodus and Leviticus, and the interesting thing about the passages is these talk about how we treat each other, right? So harm and retaliation, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of thing, is justified. So in other words, the law in the Torah says that if somebody willfully wrongs you, there is a restoration that's required. So we talked about this last time, right? And that is good. That seems good and right. Somebody wrongs you in some way, that there's a restitution made when it's done willfully. But Jesus said something different without violating that principle. So if you guys remember, the quote is, you've heard it, this is 5:38 by the way, you've heard it, that it had been said, so he's quoting now, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you, ye resist not evil, whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him 20, etc. Giveth to him that asketh of thee, from him would bar of thee, and turn not away. So all these things, Jesus sort of takes this idea of not retaliation, and he sticks something at the end about just giving to people who ask from it, right? From you, which is weird. Like, those things don't fit. Those are two different categories. They don't fit what's going on. And his point is really important, is that yes, when you are wronged, again, willfully wrong. We're not discussing accidents and all that kind of stuff. Restitution is a right and good thing. But Jesus says something different. He says, you know what? You can give up that right. You can decide not to require that. And in that moment, if you go back and think about the things we talked about a few passages earlier about the first mover forgiveness and how transformative that was, Jesus is saying, hey, these instances are opportunities to do the exact same thing. So he's not advocating just let somebody roll over you, and he says you do something back to them that is transformative. And so I heard a couple of examples of this. So one of them, one of these quotes in here says, whoever compels you to go a mile, go with him too. The context there is a Roman soldier could compel an Israelite to carry his armor and his stuff, whatever he had, for 1 mile. That was the statute or the law, and you could fulfill that duty. And so obviously you guys know what happens, right? At some point, Roman soldiers, whether they're just bad people or having a bad day, they're going to take advantage of that, right? In other words, they're going to find ways to ensure the Israelites carry their stuff. Maybe they do it to degrade the Israelites. Maybe they just do it because they can. Hey, the stuff's heavy. Why not? I can do this. The idea that to go with them too is actually subversive. Think about it. What the rule said, they could compel you for 1 month. So why would you go to? Well, what if in the process of having to be a part of that system, the Israelite had the opportunity to affect and potentially transform the Roman soldier? Like what if his mode of thinking about this wasn't, I've got to do this. And the example I heard, it was actually really powerful because it kind of blended a bunch of important things together. So the example I heard was this. Imagine an Israelite around the Sea of Galilee on the Sabbath, right? So they are there resting, on the Sabbath, celebrating the Sabbath, and then they're compelled to break the Sabbath because of the Roman occupation, right? So it's a bit of a tension and a conflict. And you can leave it right there and talk about how all that stuff is wrong, and it doesn't change anything. And yet, what if in that moment of that soldier saying, hey, take my stuff, I don't care that it's your Sabbath, the Israelite says to the soldier, you know what, I'm going to carry your stuff all the way to your house because you look tired. And I know you've probably been carrying this a lot longer than you're asking me to carry it for. So let me make your day better. That's a subversive, powerful thing, because what it does is it takes away from the construct the power of the Roman occupation, right? So the rule said you have to do this. If you don't do this, they can do bad stuff to you, like hurt you or whatever. But if you take away the power and say, you know what, this isn't about that rule. I'm looking at you as a fellow human being, and you look tired, and I could do this for you. All of a sudden, remember how we talked about the sort of that pyramid of people in Roman society? One of the things that's embedded in that we didn't really talk much about is the idea of patronage. In other words, owing somebody something. And you never wanted to owe people below you on the pyramid. Like you would not want to be sort of in the middle of the pyramid and then be in debt to somebody. That's dishonoring. You know what I'm saying? It kind of messes up. All of a sudden, it kind of elevates that person to your level or brings you down, however you want to think about it. The vertical structure of that was super important. It was embedded in how they thought. It was like fish swimming in water. They didn't even think about it. Fish don't know they're wet, kind of thing. So when, again, this little made-up story we have that is sort of trying to expound on what Jesus is teaching is, we have this idea that power and that structure gets totally blown away. Because the Israelites is not saying, okay, begrudgingly I will do it. The Israelite is saying back to the Roman soldier, I see you now. Not in this structure, not in this sort of hierarchy, not as an occupying force, not as somebody I hate, but just as the same human being that God created. And I will do this for you. Right? Now, not easy, but seems to have the same quality to it as that sort of transformative forgiveness. Right? That first mover, I'm going to forgive before you ask it. I'm not going to, hold you and judge you against the wrong that we both know you did. I'm going to do something else. Right? And this is the idea embedded in that. So it's a hard thing, right? But it's a powerful thing as well, because it totally upends the way people thought. There was an allusion, or the next piece of it, of the teaching goes in the same direction, right? And so what it says is, now this is important to note the wording here. You have heard it said, okay, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. Now that's actually not in the Old Testament. Love thy neighbor, yes. Hate thy enemy, no. Okay? So it's not a command. You've heard it said. So that was a clue. I would not have picked up on this necessarily without some help. But think about this for a second. Jesus had gone from, it is written, to you have heard it said. So in other words, the construct behind it is you were hearing somebody else teach you something. And the teaching is love your neighbor, hate your enemy. Okay? Now that doesn't seem to sit in the teaching that Jesus has given us so far, right? Nowhere in his construct about the grounding of the law of love is there room for hating somebody. And so then, the quote, by the way, is from Leviticus 19. There's another one, but Leviticus 19 is particularly interesting. And if you go read Leviticus 19, there's this discussion. And it's about all kinds of things, about how you treat people. And it's interesting. It says, you will apply these rules, so to speak, equally among all people within Israel. Okay? From the highest to the lowest. Even those that have had to sell themselves into bond servanthood or slavery to another family will be able to trust and be treated equally, regardless of their status. Okay? Powerful, super powerful idea right there in and of itself. But there's still a border. There's still a border there. And this is the border that Jesus sort of crashes right through. Neighbor, in the context of Leviticus 19, it even talks about immigrants who come into the Israelite community. Right? So they come in peacefully and they integrate with the Israelites. They are to be treated the same. Okay? Total equality was the rule. So that's powerful in itself, right? Except for there was these debates, right? That occurred, which are good debates. But I mean, I say debates not in like a bunch of people yelling and screaming at each other, but just the idea of trying to understand it. And this is one of the things that I think we could learn a good lesson from the Israelites, the rabbis and stuff. Not that they always got it right, because they say some crazy things sometimes, but there was this desire to sort of take Scripture and just examine it and figure out how to apply it and take it apart and say, does it work here? Does it work in that situation? So in this case, one of the key discussion points and one of the key questions they had was, who is the neighbor? What makes a neighbor? Is it the person that lives next to me? Is it just my people in my village? Is it Israelite nation as a whole? And so that idea was really powerful, right? They were trying to figure out how does this work? This came from God. He didn't really explain a bunch of it, and we're trying to figure out what this really means. Where do you draw? What does neighbor mean, right? And we know this was going on because you can find it in writings after the Old Testament closes, before the time of Jesus. There's these rabbis who talk about back and forth. They quote various passages, etc. And even in the time of Jesus, you guys know this, later in the story, they're going to ask him about who's my neighbor. There's a whole thing about that, right? The Good Samaritan parable. Who is my neighbor? And Jesus' answer to the question is everyone. Everyone's your neighbor. There are no restrictions involved. Everybody deserves to be treated the same because in God's eyes, we are all the same. No one outranks anybody. Nobody's more valuable or less valuable. Hard thing. I mean, just think about it. Like, imagine if right now in America, like we were invaded by an occupying force, and we were coming to church, but there's soldiers at the door. And if I say the wrong thing, if I talk against the occupying force and government, like they shoot me or something. Like we would A, spend a lot of time in fear, and then B, we'd get very angry about it. Over time, there'd be this chafing, this sort of friction. We'd be like, we are tired. This is not the way it's supposed to be. And then imagine having to then look at the guy with the gun who's about to shoot me and be able to see him the way God sees him. Hard thing to do, which is the whole reason why Jesus introduces this whole teaching grounded in this idea of the law is grounded in the nature of God and his love for himself and for us. That is so important. That I linked that for you to Jeremiah 31 and said, hey, there will be a time when there's a new covenant, and that new covenant is going to do something to you. It's going to be embedded inside of you. It's not going to be on these tables of stone that are in the temple. It's going to be inside of you, and it's going to change you and make you able to do those things that seem so hard. Okay? This is how the whole thing's working. And so at the end of it, there's this idea of being, that makes you different, right? That would make you different. That'd make the Israelite different. All of a sudden, that's another category to be able to do that. Like you're not playing the same game. You're not part of the same construct. You've somehow stepped outside of that world, right? Which is, by the way, the very definition of holy. Holiness we tend to overemphasize in our modern Western culture the moral good aspect of holiness. That is absolutely there, but it's like taking something, it's like going into one of those little, what are they called, like amusement park things where the mirrors are all bent and it makes like your head big and your body small. That's kind of the thing going on, right? Holiness, just if you sort of stripped away all the language about it and just looked at how it works, it's very simple. It just means something super special, and it needs to be preserved, and you don't want to pollute it. And so holiness is about being other than. It's somehow different than. That's why is God holy? Because he's not like us, right? And there's no, you can hear that from a morality perspective, but I would argue, just listen to it from an ontological perspective. He is of a different kind or nature. You see what I'm saying? We are complete, just like we are, relatively speaking, different and other than other members of the animal kingdom. Right? We're not the same. Similar, yes, but we are altogether different, right? In that we possess things like consciousness, for example. Anyway, my point is, all that says, be ye holy as God is holy. Now, you can't be ontologically like God. Can't do it. Ontologically just means nature. So it's just, when I say ontological, it is the nature of something. Okay? You can't be like God's nature because you're not. So what's the Bible telling us to do? Reflect him. All right? Does this sound familiar? Page 1 of the Bible. You're to be his image bearer. Right? You can't be him, but you can be his image bearer. Right? And so for Jesus, all this stuff is sort of, it's baked in. Like this is all part of sort of almost why he says what he says. I'm not claiming to speak authoritatively about how Jesus thought about things, but I'm just saying his teaching seems to be sort of infused with that concept. And so that when you hear these teachings, right, it's all about, you don't get to draw borders. All right? You know what happens? He says at the end of this passage, verse 45. Right, so the whole Matthew passage is, ye have heard it been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use and persecute you. Why do you do this? Verse 45 says, that ye may be children of your Father. Now, if you remember the past teaching we had at the end of last year, where we studied the tree metaphor in the Bible, beginning to end. Seed was directly tied to the idea of being a child. right? Children of somebody, right? So this idea of being a child is also the idea of being the image bearer, the reflector, right? The seeds of trees bear fruit. They're one kind after another, right? And that idea of being like apple seeds make apple trees that make apple fruit. Watermelon seeds make watermelon vines that make watermelon. That's a fruit, right? Let's call it a fruit. I forget. I know one of those is a messed up. Tomatoes are like opposite or whatever. Anyways, you get what I'm saying, right? Watermelon seeds don't make apples, right? So the idea of being sort of a child of is to be like the parent, which is another way of saying like the image bearer, right? And so at the end of the whole thing, it says, do this, behave this way, which is an incredibly hard thing to do. I'll grant you guys that, so that you will be bearing the image of God who loves everybody. You see how this works, right? This fits together nicely. Like when you kind of land on that conclusion, you can now make sense of it, right? He goes on to say the following thing, which I think is really powerful, and this will be interesting to see if it lands for you. So this is what he says. Verse 46, right? Or verse 45. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love them which love you, what reward have you? Do not even the publicans do the same? And if you salute your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even publicans do the same? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which in heaven is perfect. That's a quote from Leviticus 19, same chapter. See how that works? Same exact chapter. He's quoting from it. So you can safely assume, because he's quoted the chapter twice, he's got the whole thing sort of in the back of his mind, so to speak. And this is where he's talking from. Direct quotes like that are meant for us to sort of see the bigger picture of the reference, right? So what he's saying is be like God, and to be like God is to not draw the border. It is easy to be nice to people of your family or tribe. Yes? It's much easier. Right? But what about people who aren't part of your little clique or your little sort of sphere of influence? A little bit harder, right? What about enemies? Right? When he says enemies, he doesn't just say people you don't like. He says specifically them that curse you, right? That despitefully use you and persecute you. Okay, so these are people taking action, harmful action against you. These aren't just like, hey, they're the enemy vaguely. This is specifically people who have caused you harm. Very hard thing to do. But what does he say? You don't get to draw the border and exclude those folks because God did. Right? The Father did. It is easy it is easy to see how this gets distorted. So, there are gazillions of examples right now of groups of people who sort of identify, we'll call them tribes, because that fits with biblical language, right? They think they're all of the same tribe and they go off and they do something, right? There are people who've done things, who've been arrested, right? Put in jail because they're part of a mob that they would never have done by themselves. You see this, right? The point is, there's something about when we sort of group ourselves together and draw those borders that somehow the personal responsibility piece is disconnected. Now you're sort of part. That's why they call it mob rule. That's a real thing, and that's a phenomenon that sociologists study. Like, why is it a group of people can get together and do some things that individually, them by themselves would never have done, but somehow they get together, and because they're identifying as a group, they see it's okay to go do something, sometimes horrible things. Now, just so we're absolutely clear, Groups of people aren't bad because churches groups of people. You can have that same effect work in the other direction. Groups of people can come together and do things they never thought they would have been able to do on their own and that are incredibly good. But on this case, we're sort of looking at the brokenness of human nature, right? And how that can go terribly wrong. And how our, sort of identity amongst each other has a way of excluding others. And Jesus is saying, destroy the border. Doesn't exist. That's your border. That's not my Father's border. Because he didn't have border, right? That term love, we talked about this, agape, I think last time a little bit, is that term is the love that is externally focused on the other solely. It's the simplest way to think about it. It's whatever is good for the other. It is focused on and about. It is not an emotional feeling at all. Agape is a verb that results in action and is made possible by a transformation that Jesus would say is this new covenant with your imaging God, who the ongoing dwelling of His presence in your life allows you to do that. And the whole thing kind of coming together. But you see my point. Is that it's not an emotional. That's a 1700s and later idea of what love means. We have one word. The Bible has a bunch. The Greek words for love are different. Agape is one of them. There's one that's related to Philadelphia. It's phileo or something like that. Brotherly love, etc. I forgot the rest of them. But there's a whole bunch of words that we all just translate as love, and we apply it different ways. So sometimes that's why we get distortions, right? And that happens anytime you translate things. So the point Jesus is making is, how come is it, like if you guys just did the stuff that made sense within your borders, you're no different than the people who don't have any allegiance to knowledge of love for the Father. He's like, you look the same. Like you sort of side by side, like you're not doing anything different. So what does that even mean? Like if you're no different than them, and you're claiming to have, this special relationship with God, what does that even? So what if it looks the same? That's the challenge Jesus is kind of pushing back out there. There's a whole section. Next time, I want you guys to go read. Not that you haven't been, so I'm going to trust that you read a little bit here and there. But I want you to read, starting in chapter 6. We're going to get to the thing that we typically call the Lord's Prayer. But I want you to look at what's around it. So you guys know that prayer. It's pretty familiar. But I'm almost positive, and without reading it again, you won't know what's before and after. And why it's sitting where it's sitting, which I think would illuminate what it means to have this prayer. So do that for me next time. Just read chapter 6 again if you've read it a few times, maybe just reorient yourself to it, and then we'll tackle that the next time. Okay? Let's say a prayer. We'll go to church. Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you so much for challenging us with your words and the life of your Son. Lord, help us to want to be the image bearers you called us to be and made us to be. Give us the strength and wisdom to do that and the desire to do that. Lord, help us to honor and glorify you in the service of Christ, I pray. Amen.